Mount Rainier doesn't look like a threat at first glance. It stands quiet, snow-covered, almost perfect against the sky, the kind of mountain people photograph, hike, and admire without a second thought. But what makes Rainier the most dangerous volcano in the lower 48 states isn't what you see. It's what's sitting on top of it. Beneath that calm white surface are 25 massive glaciers, holding more than 8 billion cubic meters of ice. Not solid rock, not slow-moving lava, water, waiting. And here's where the story shifts. Because when that much ice meets heat, or when part of the mountain simply gives way, it doesn't melt quietly. It transforms into something far more violent. A lahar, a fast-moving wall of mud, rock, and water, dense enough to bury entire towns, and fast enough that escape becomes a race against minutes, not hours. This isn't about an eruption you can see coming. It's about a collapse that can begin without warning, and once it starts, it doesn't stop. The real question isn't if Rainier is dangerous. It's how long people would have when it finally moves. Subscribe now and turn on notifications to stay updated. And tell me in the comments, how much time do you think is enough to escape something like this? From a distance, Mount Rainier looks stable, almost timeless. But the reality is far more complex once you move beyond the surface. The summit holds 25 named glaciers, forming the largest glacial system on a single peak in the continental United States. Together, they contain more than 8 billion cubic meters of ice. Not scattered patches, but a continuous mass of frozen water layered across the upper slopes. Geographically, Rainier sits in a critical position. Roughly 85 kilometers from Seattle and about 60 kilometers from Tacoma, it rises directly above a network of river valleys that stretch into some of the most populated areas in Washington state. These valleys are not empty. They carry roads, homes, schools, and entire communities downstream. What makes this setup so dangerous is not just the volume of ice, but where that ice is positioned. It's elevated, unstable, and connected to steep channels that act like natural pathways. If anything disrupts the balance, heat from below, structural weakening, or even seismic shaking, gravity takes over. And when gravity takes over here, it doesn't move slowly. It sends everything downward, following the exact same routes that water has carved for thousands of years straight toward the places where people now live. The mountain may appear still, but the system beneath it is anything but. To understand why Mount Rainier is different, you have to understand one word that geologists use carefully: lahar. At first, it sounds technical, almost distant. But the reality is much more physical and far more immediate. A lahar is not lava. It doesn't glow, and it doesn't creep slowly across the ground. Instead, it behaves like a fast-moving river of destruction, a dense mixture of water, mud, and volcanic debris. Imagine wet concrete, but in motion. Now imagine it accelerating downhill at speeds that can reach highway levels. What makes Rainier especially dangerous is how easily a lahar can form. It doesn't require a dramatic eruption. When heat from the volcano interacts with the massive glaciers above, or when part of the mountain's weakened structure collapses, that frozen water can suddenly transform. Not gradually, but all at once. And once it begins, it builds momentum. As the flow moves, it picks up everything in its path: trees, rocks, structures, increasing in both volume and force. It doesn't slow down when it reaches flatter ground. It spreads, thickens, and continues forward, filling entire valleys. This is what changes the equation. Because unlike many natural hazards, a lahar doesn't give people time to process what's happening. There's no long build-up, no clear visual warning from a distance. By the time it's visible, it's already close. And at that point, the difference between safety and disaster is no longer distance. It's time. What makes this threat more than just a possibility is its history. Mount Rainier has produced more than 60 lahars over the past 10,000 years. Not one rare event, but a repeated pattern written into the landscape itself. Each flow followed the same river valleys, carving paths that still exist today. One of the largest, known as the Osceola mudflow, occurred roughly 5,600 years ago. It traveled more than 120 kilometers, reaching all the way to what is now Puget Sound. Entire sections of the mountain collapsed in a single event, sending a massive wave of mud and debris across the region. What matters is where that material ended up. Modern towns like Orting, Sumner, Kent, Auburn, and parts of Tacoma are built directly on top of these ancient deposits. The ground beneath homes, roads, and infrastructure is not just soil, it is the aftermath of past collapses. Geologists have identified that the same valleys have been buried at least 16 times since the end of the last ice age. That means this is not an unpredictable anomaly. It is a cycle. And cycles don't disappear just because cities are built on top of them. The landscape remembers every event, even if people don't. So when looking at Rainier today, the question is no longer whether it has the capability to produce another large lahar. It's how many times it has already done it, and what that implies for the future. The scale of the risk becomes clearer when you look at who lives in the path. The recent assessments now estimate that around 150,000 people are living within zones that could be directly impacted by a major lahar. These are not distant rural areas. They are active communities with homes, schools, hospitals, and transportation networks woven into the river valleys that drain Mount Rainier. Towns like Orting sit at the center of this exposure. With a population of roughly 9,000, it is positioned directly on top of past lahar deposits and directly within the path of future flows. Further downstream, cities such as Sumner, Puyallup, Kent, Auburn, and Tacoma expand that exposure into larger urban systems. What makes this especially complex is how interconnected everything is. Roads that serve as daily commute routes also double as potential evacuation corridors. Schools that function as safe spaces during normal conditions are located inside zones that could be overtaken in under an hour. Even critical infrastructure lies within reach. The Puyallup River system leads toward the port of Tacoma, a major economic hub handling millions of shipping containers each year. A large lahar would not only threaten lives, but disrupt a significant part of the regional and national supply chain. This is what transforms the hazard into something broader than a geological concern. It becomes a population challenge, an infrastructure challenge, and a timing challenge all at once. The danger of a lahar is not just its force, it's the speed at which everything unfolds. In a realistic collapse scenario, the timeline is measured in minutes, not hours. It doesn't begin with a dramatic explosion or a visible warning from miles away. It can start with something subtle, a small seismic swarm, a hydrothermal disturbance, or even a distant earthquake, strong enough to destabilize the mountain's weakened upper slopes. Once that initial failure begins, the sequence accelerates rapidly. Within the first 10 minutes, a portion of the upper flank can break loose, pulling ice and debris with it. By 20 minutes, that mass has transformed into a fully developed lahar, moving down the river valleys at speeds approaching 80 kilometers per hour. At around 40 minutes, the flow can reach communities like Orting. By 60 to 90 minutes, it can spread toward the outer areas of Tacoma. This is not a slow-moving threat that allows time for verification or hesitation. Each stage builds directly on the one before it, compressing decision-making into an increasingly narrow window. Emergency plans in the region are built around this reality. Drills are timed, routes are mapped, and response systems are designed to act immediately, because once the process starts, there is no pause. And in that compressed timeline, even a few minutes can define the difference between escape and impact. The real instability at Mount Rainier is not happening on the surface. It's happening inside the mountain itself. Over thousands of years, Rainier's upper structure has been gradually weakened by hydrothermal activity. Heat from the shallow magma system rises upward, carrying sulfuric gases and steam. As these fluids move through the rock, they don't just pass through, they chemically alter it. Solid volcanic rock is slowly transformed into soft, clay-rich material. And that change matters. Because unlike strong rock that can hold its shape under pressure, this altered material behaves more like saturated soil. It loses cohesion. It absorbs water, and under stress, it can fail suddenly. Surveys have identified more than 200 million cubic meters of this weakened rock sitting along the upper flanks of the mountain. That is not a small fracture. It is a large, structurally compromised zone positioned directly beneath massive glacial weight. This creates a critical imbalance. You have heavy ice pressing down from above, weakened material beneath, and gravity constantly pulling everything downhill. It doesn't require a full volcanic eruption to trigger failure. A moderate earthquake, a small hydrothermal explosion, or even gradual internal shifting can be enough to start the process. And once that upper section begins to slide, it doesn't move alone. It drags glaciers with it. What begins as a structural failure quickly transitions into a full-scale lahar, turning instability inside the mountain into a fast-moving hazard outside of it. For a threat that moves this fast, everything depends on one thing: warning time. Along the river valleys surrounding Mount Rainier, a monitoring network has been installed to detect the earliest signs of a lahar. This system combines acoustic flow monitors, seismometers, and ground sensors designed to pick up vibrations as a collapse begins and the flow starts moving downstream. In theory, it provides a critical window, enough time to trigger sirens, alert communities, and begin evacuation. But the reality is more fragile. An independent audit in 2022 found that over 30% of these sensors were either offline, outdated, or only communicating intermittently. Upgrades have been planned, but delays have pushed back full implementation more than once. Under optimal conditions, experts estimate that residents in high-risk areas like Orting could receive around 40 minutes of warning. That's already a narrow margin. In less ideal conditions, that window shrinks dramatically. A power outage could reduce warning time to under 10 minutes. A nighttime event triggered by seismic activity could mean that the first indication isn't an alert, but the sound of the flow itself. And that changes everything, because a warning system is only as effective as its reliability. When time is measured in minutes, even small gaps in detection are not minor issues. They redefine what prepared actually means. When you step back from individual events, a broader pattern begins to appear. Geological records show that Mount Rainier has produced large lahars, reaching far into the lowlands multiple times over the past several thousand years. In fact, at least 2 major flows have reached the Puget Sound area within the last 5,500 years. From this data, scientists estimate a recurrence interval roughly 1 significant event every 500 to 1,000 years. That number is not a prediction. It doesn't point to a specific date or countdown. But it does define a range, a window of probability based on past behavior. And within that window, the present moment becomes harder to ignore. The last major lahar of this scale is believed to have occurred around the year 500. That places the current timeline well within the same interval identified in the geological record. Again, this does not mean an event is imminent, but it does raise a more grounded question. If a system has shown repeated large-scale failures over time, and if the conditions that enabled those failures still exist, then how should the current risk be understood? Because in systems like this, the absence of recent activity doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes, it simply means the cycle hasn't completed yet. At this point, the risk at Mount Rainier becomes clearer, but also more difficult to interpret. Because unlike many volcanoes, the primary danger here is not tied to a visible eruption. There is no need for ash clouds, lava flows, or explosive activity to create a catastrophic outcome. The real trigger can be structural. A collapse of weakened rock, combined with the massive glacial system above, is enough to generate a large-scale lahar. And that process can begin with limited surface signals, subtle seismic activity, internal shifting, or hydrothermal changes that don't immediately appear dramatic. This changes how the threat is understood. It is no longer about waiting for a clear warning sign that something is about to happen. It becomes a question of whether the system remains stable, and for how long. In that sense, Rainier operates differently from the way people often imagine volcanic hazards. The concern is not centered on eruption timing. It is centered on structural failure. And structural failure does not always follow a predictable pattern that people can easily recognize in advance, which means the risk is not only physical. It is also about uncertainty and how much of it can be managed before it becomes reality. At this stage, the situation leaves more questions than answers. If a large portion of the detection system is not fully reliable, what is the actual warning time people can depend on, not in theory, but in reality? If a lahar can be triggered without a clear eruption, how do communities decide when to act? Evacuating too early has costs. Waiting too long has consequences that can't be reversed. And if the historical pattern suggests that events of this scale occur within a certain interval, where exactly does the present moment fall within that cycle? These are not abstract concerns. They are practical decisions that affect real communities living downstream every day. Because the challenge here is not just understanding the hazard. It's responding to it under uncertainty, where timing, trust in the system, and human reaction all intersect. And when those elements don't align perfectly, the margin for error becomes very small. Mount Rainier still stands the same way it always has, high, quiet, and unchanged to the eye. The rivers continue to flow through the valleys. Communities go on with their daily routines, unaware of how closely everything is connected to the mountain above. Nothing appears urgent. Nothing demands immediate attention. And yet, beneath that calm surface, the same forces that shape this landscape are still active. The system hasn't disappeared. It has only remained still for now. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe now and turn on notifications to stay informed with clear, fact-based updates. Your support helps bring more in-depth content like this to you. And share your perspective below. How prepared do you think communities really are for something like this?